The story is told about a senior citizen who went for his annual physical. As it was ending, he told his doctor that he thought his wife was losing her hearing, and he wondered how he could test it to see if this was the case. The doctor said, when you go home, call out to your wife when you enter the house and see if she responds. So when he got home, he entered the house through the front door and called out, "Hi, honey, I'm home. What's for dinner?" There was no response. He figured that she was in the kitchen, so he went into the living room and called out again, "Hi, honey, I'm home. What's for dinner?" Still no response. He did this a few more times until he ended up in the kitchen right next to her. He said again, "Hi, honey, I'm home. What's for dinner?" She looked at him and said, "Meatloaf for the 6th time." Who is deaf and why? That's the question we face in all the readings that we have just heard proclaimed. We'll begin with Isaiah and move 5 centuries down to the time of Christ. And then, as we always must do, ask what all this means to us some 2,000 years later. Our first reading is from the prophet Isaiah. But which Isaiah? There are 3 sections to Isaiah's narrative, and probably given the length of time of Isaiah's prophesying, over 70 years, probably 3 different Isaiahs. The pre-exilic Isaiah, the Isaiah in exile, and the post-exilic Isaiah. Here in chapter 35, we hear Isaiah writing to the people of Israel who are in exile. The prophet is the messenger of God and God's good news, and is announcing it to those who have been broken by the hardships of life, those who are weak and filled with fear. God is coming to bring new life. Isaiah describes 4 healing situations: the blind see, the deaf hear, the lame leap, the mute sing. These cures symbolize the transformative power of God who comes to save the people. Those who are in any way prevented from living life to the fullest will be freed from impediments and will sing and dance with joy. The life-giving water that is promised symbolizes whatever is needed to achieve this peace and fullness of life. All creation will be renewed. Moving ahead to today's gospel, Mark offers a vision of the eschatological fulfillment of Isaiah's promise. Eyes opened, ears unstopped, hearts leaping for joy. Jesus demonstrates that the messianic age has arrived and that he is the Messiah. He is far more than just another miracle worker. With Jesus, a new age has begun, and he calls it the kingdom of God. The geographical details of this story add essential information to the message. Jesus is outside the land of Israel. He is no longer in Jewish territory, but in Gentile territory. Jesus is extending his mission, exercising his healing powers among the Gentiles. He is giving notice that he has come to save all members of the human family, not just the Jews. The crowd's faith brings the deaf and mute man to Jesus. The crowd stands in front of Jesus with the hope that God's power will act through him. They are not disappointed. The details of the healing are quite standard for this time, and they include taking the man aside, using touch, saliva, and incantation. The miracle is accomplished by Jesus' command in Aramaic, "Ephphatha," be opened. It is the verbum efficax, the word that effects the healing. In an oral culture, such as ancient Israel, those who cannot hear are marginalized. This is further heightened by Israel's preeminent prayer, the Shema Israel, "Hear, O Israel." The deaf man could not hear the very covenant promises upon which his life was built. The evangelist gives fresh meaning to the story by the place where he locates it. It's not only about the deaf man, but it also symbolizes what is happening to Jesus' disciples. They have been deaf to Jesus' words, and are yet unable to make any confession of faith in him. Eventually, however, at Caesarea Philippi, it will begin to dawn on them who Jesus really is, and Peter will make his confession of faith. Thus, the ears of his disciples will be opened, their tongues will be released, and they will speak plainly, declaring through their spokesman Peter, "You are the Messiah." Jesus' acts of healing, while important in themselves, are also signs of how God is acting to heal and transform a world marred by human sin and injustice. This brings us to the perennial question, who is deaf and why? The deaf man is all of us. What can we not hear? The cry of the poor. Could we get any clearer advice on how we are to do this than what we heard from St. James in the second reading today? James points out how we should treat one another, whether one is rich or poor. He's not writing speculative theology, but reacting to real hurts inflicted on real people, and calling us all to a higher level of charity and responsibility. While we see Jesus eliminate distinctions between Jew and Gentile, the members of James' audience are reestablishing them with their own community based upon wealth and status. The partiality James condemns permeates our world, our society, our church, and our hearts. We must allow Jesus to heal our spiritual deafness and muteness, and through us heal others who are deaf and mute. God gives us the charge to sense the plight of the poor. Jesus touches our ears and our mouth and says to each one of us one powerful word, Ephphatha, be opened. Be opened and perceive the injustice to the immigrant or other ethnic or racial minorities. Can we see them? Or do we look the other way? Do we hear the cries of the poor, the pleas of injustice, or do we close our ears because it's too painful to listen? Do we allow ourselves to become the voice for the voiceless and speak when something is wrong? Or do we keep silent because that's so much easier, even when we know that correction, challenge, or change is necessary in the face of death-dealing injustice? Like he did to the man in the gospel, Jesus lovingly touches us and says one powerful word, Ephphatha, be opened. Open your eyes, open your hearts, open your ears, open your lips. Our ears have been opened to hear the good news of God's unconditional love. Our tongues have been loosened to speak out the truth that this unconditional love is for all, and no one is excluded.